The galactic summit was in chaos. The Duravek swarm, a ruthless force of AI-controlled warships, was advancing toward Varelian Prime. The summit chamber, filled with representatives from the most powerful alien civilizations, buzzed with fear and desperation. The Duravek were not just conquerors, they were exterminators. Every species they encountered had either been enslaved or wiped out completely. No known fleet had ever survived a direct confrontation with them. In the grand hall of the summit, holographic projections displayed the size of the approaching enemy fleet. It was massive, stretching across the void like a black tide. The elite of the galaxy, admirals, kings, and council leaders, spoke in hushed, worried tones. Their fleets had been the strongest in known space, yet they all knew the truth. Against the Duravek, they stood no chance. A towering reptilian admiral from the Selvar Dominion slammed his fist on the table, his sharp teeth bared. "We are doomed. The swarm has already torn through our outer defenses like they were nothing. We need a plan." The silence in the chamber was thick with fear, but then a single voice spoke. Calm, steady. "We have already sent our flagship," said Captain Geo, the human representative. Every eye in the room turned toward him. Geo stood tall, his face emotionless, his uniform crisp. The other delegates exchanged looks before breaking into laughter. Loud, mocking laughter echoed through the chamber. The humans scoffed an Icarian noble, her translucent blue skin glowing under the dim summit lights. "You think your tiny fleet can do anything against this force? What could your primitive world possibly have?" Geo didn't react. He simply glanced at the massive holographic display. The enemy fleet was approaching fast. Then suddenly, a new signal appeared. The laughter died instantly. A massive object, far larger than any known warship, was approaching Varelian Prime at high speed. It was cloaked, its systems unreadable, but its energy signature was enormous. It wasn't just another warship. It was something else entirely. Panic spread through the summit chamber. "What is that?" gasped a Selvar tactician. "That's not one of ours. I don't recognize that energy reading." The cloaked vessel moved with terrifying precision, slipping through the enemy's perimeter undetected. Then, in a sudden burst of energy, it decloaked. The chamber fell silent. There, hanging in space above Varelian Prime, was the Erebus. It was a supercarrier, a behemoth unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It dwarfed the fleets of the other species, its dark hull absorbing the light of nearby stars. Its structure was sharp, angular, built for war. Towering railguns lined its sides, its fighter bays stretching endlessly. Every inch of the vessel radiated power. The galactic elite, once so confident in their superiority, now found themselves speechless. Then, without warning, the Duravek swarm launched their attack. The enemy ships surged forward, weapons lighting up the void. Energy beams, missiles, and plasma blasts rained toward Varelian Prime. The planetary defenses activated, but they were weak compared to the sheer power of the Duravek. But before the enemy could reach the planet, the Erebus moved. With a single command from Commander Hanuel, the supercarrier's railguns fired. Massive tungsten rounds, moving at near light speed, tore through the enemy formation. Entire Duravek warships exploded instantly. Fighters swarmed from the Erebus, sleek and deadly, cutting through enemy lines with unnatural precision. The ship's shields flared as enemy fire struck, but it held, unshaken. From the summit chamber, the galactic leaders watched in stunned silence. The humans, once dismissed as weak, were tearing the enemy apart. But the Duravek were relentless. Their warships adjusted their formations, launching a coordinated counterattack. The Erebus shook under the impact of their assault. Then, in a terrifying display of strategy, the Duravek launched boarding pods. Hundreds of them. Inside the Erebus, alarms blared as hulking AI soldiers breached the hull. Human marines, clad in power armor, rushed to meet them. The corridors became a battleground. Sergeant Minji led a squad through the chaos, her pulse rifle cutting down enemy forces. Blood and oil mixed on the cold metal floors. Despite their advanced technology, the Duravak were unrelenting. The battle was brutal, unforgiving. On the bridge, Commander Haniel remained calm. He saw the bigger picture. The Duravak were adapting too fast. If they didn't do something drastic, the battle would turn. He clenched his fists. There was only one option left. All power to weapons, he ordered. Target their flagship. The Erebus turned, its main cannon charging. The Duravak flagship loomed ahead, its doomsday weapon priming to fire. The bridge shook violently as enemy rounds struck. Reports came in. More breaches, more casualties. Minji's squad was cut off. Captain Jiho, monitoring from the summit chamber, clenched his jaw. The galaxy's leaders still watched, their eyes filled with something new. Not just fear. Respect. Haniel gave the final command. Fire. A blinding light engulfed the battlefield as the Erebus unleashed its full might. The enemy flagship was torn apart, its core detonating in a massive explosion. The shockwave rippled through the enemy fleet. Without their leader, the Duravak hesitated. And then, one by one, they fell. The battle was won, but at a cost. Minji's final transmission had been lost. Many had died. The Erebus was damaged, its once mighty hull scarred. As the dust settled, the galactic leaders turned to Jiho. Their expressions were no longer condescending. They had seen what humanity was capable of. "You saved us," whispered the Acarian noble who had mocked him before. Jiho gave her a hard look. "No," he said, "we saved ourselves." The message was clear. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were no longer the weak species of the galaxy. They had fought. They had won. And now, they were legends. The void above Varelian Prime was filled with chaos. The Duravak fleet advanced like a storm. A relentless tide of cold, mechanical destruction. Their ships moved with terrifying precision, massive and sleek, weapons glowing with a deadly light. The galactic defense forces scrambled, but everyone knew the truth. Their fleets were nothing more than a speed bump. The Duravak had already destroyed civilizations far stronger than those gathered here. In the summit chamber, fear gripped the air like a vice. The galactic elite, beings of power and influence, were powerless in the face of this unstoppable force. Their voices rose in panic, their carefully maintained composure breaking under the weight of impending doom. And then the readings appeared. At first, it was just a blip, a signal so massive it didn't make sense. It grew stronger, closer, until every sensor in the system was screaming about an incoming object of unprecedented scale. The chamber fell into an eerie silence. Eyes turned toward the display as the unknown vessel approached. The size of its energy signature was staggering. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. And then, it appeared. The Erebus decloaked above Varelian Prime, and the entire system seemed to hold its breath. The ship was a monster. Its dark, sleek frame stretched endlessly across the void, dwarfing every other vessel in the system. The surface of the Erebus was covered in weapons, massive railguns, missile arrays, and strange, humming structures no one could identify. The hull seemed to absorb the light around it, casting long, ominous shadows. There was no decoration, no elegance, only brutal, functional design. It was a ship built for war, and it exuded power. In the summit chamber, the laughter and mockery of humanity were long forgotten. The galactic elite stared in stunned silence. Their most advanced warships looked like toys in comparison. On the bridge of the Erebus, Commander Haniel stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the enemy fleet. He was a man of few words, his face carved from stone, his mind focused only on the battle ahead. Around him, the crew moved with calm efficiency. They had trained for this moment, and there was no room for fear. "Enemy fleet is in position," reported the tactical officer. They're preparing to fire. Let them, Haniel said quietly. The Duravik attacked. Beams of energy and streams of missiles surged toward Varelian Prime, a wave of destruction meant to wipe out the planet and everyone on it. But before the weapons could reach their target, the Erebus responded. The railguns fired first. The sound of the shots reverberated through the massive ship, a low, bone-shaking thrum. Tungsten rounds accelerated to near-light speed, and the effect was immediate. Duravik warships exploded as the projectiles tore through their hulls with horrifying ease. Then the fighters launched. From hidden bays, swarms of sleek, AI-enhanced human fighters poured into the void. They moved with impossible speed and precision, weaving through enemy fire and striking with deadly accuracy. Duravik ships fell one after another, their formations breaking under the relentless assault. On the planet below, civilians looked up and saw the sky light up with the burning wreckage of enemy ships. For the first time, hope began to stir. Inside the summit chamber, the galactic elite could only watch in disbelief. The humans, the so-called primitive species, were turning the tide of battle with terrifying efficiency. How is this possible? Whispered the Acarian noble. Captain Geos stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. You never bothered to ask what we were capable of, he said simply. The battle raged on. The Duravik were relentless, adapting quickly. More ships moved into formation, launching coordinated strikes. The Erebus shook as enemy fire found its mark, but its shields held strong. On the bridge, Commander Haniel remained calm, issuing orders with cold precision. Focus fire on their command ships, he ordered. Disrupt their coordination. The Erebus shifted its position, unleashing a new volley of devastating firepower. Enemy command vessels erupted in flames, and the Duravik fleet began to falter. But they weren't finished yet. From the enemy lines, a new wave of ships emerged, larger, heavily armored carriers brimming with boarding pods. Hundreds of them launched toward the Erebus. Enemy boarding parties incoming. The tactical officer called out. Deploy countermeasures, Haniel responded. Prepare the Marines. Inside the ship, alarms blared. Human Marines, clad in advanced power armor, rushed to defend their vessel. In the corridors of the Erebus, brutal close-quarters combat erupted. Duravik drones poured in, their cold, mechanical forms met with human steel and fire. Sergeant Minji led her squad through the chaos. Hold the line, she shouted, her pulse rifle cutting down enemy forces. Sparks flew, and the air filled with the scent of burning metal and blood. Despite their advanced technology, the Duravik found themselves matched by human ferocity and determination. On the bridge, Haniel knew they couldn't hold out forever. The enemy was adapting too quickly. They needed to end this. Now, bring the main cannon online, he ordered. The crew hesitated. Sir, the weapon's not fully charged. Do it, Haniel snapped. Outside, the Erebus turned its massive frame toward the heart of the enemy fleet. The main cannon, a weapon of unimaginable power, began to glow. The Duravik flagship, their command center, was directly in its sights. Fire, Haniel commanded. The cannon unleashed its fury. A beam of light, brighter than any star, tore through the void. The enemy flagship had no chance. It was obliterated instantly, the shockwave rippling outward and shattering nearby vessels. The Duravik fleet collapsed into chaos. With their leadership gone, their formations broke, and human forces pushed forward. One by one, the enemy ships fell. When the last Duravik warship was destroyed, the silence that followed was deafening. The battle was over. But the victory had come at a cost. Reports of heavy casualties filtered in. Minji's squad was missing in action. The Erebus itself bore deep scars, its once pristine hull marred by battle. In the summit chamber, the galactic elite stared at the aftermath. Their fear had been replaced by something else. Awe. Captain Geos stepped forward, his voice calm. The battle is won, he said, But this is only the beginning. Humanity has shown its strength. The question now is whether the rest of you will stand with us or be left behind. No one dared to laugh this time. The quiet after the initial battle didn't last long. The wreckage of destroyed Dravik ships still drifted through the void when the alarms on the Erebus screamed to life again. New signals flashed on the tactical display. Dozens of fast-moving objects heading straight for them. Boarding pods incoming, the tactical officer called out, his voice tight with urgency. Commander Haniel didn't flinch. His face remained calm, his eyes fixed on the display. Deploy automated defenses. Prepare the Marines for close-quarters combat. The Erebus shifted, its hull bristling with weapons as defensive turrets spun into position. Flashes of light filled the void as they opened fire, targeting the incoming swarm of pods. Explosions bloomed like sudden stars, but there were too many. Dozens slipped through the barrage and latched onto the ship's hull with heavy magnetic thuds. Inside the Erebus, the corridors turned into a battlefield. Sergeant Minji led her squad through the twisting metal halls, their power armor whirring softly with every step. The armor was a marvel of human engineering, sleek, strong, and fast. And combined with their advanced weaponry, the Marines were a force to be reckoned with. "Hold this corridor," Minji ordered, her voice crackling over comms. "They're not getting past us." The first wave of Dravik drones burst through the breached airlock. They were fast and lethal, their metallic forms moving with inhuman precision. Minji's pulse rifle barked, cutting down the first few with searing bursts of energy, but more kept coming. The hallway filled with the roar of gunfire and the shriek of energy weapons. "Keep firing," Minji shouted, ducking behind cover as enemy fire scorched the wall beside her. The fighting was brutal. The Dravik didn't stop, didn't hesitate. They advanced in perfect synchronization, and for every drone the Marines cut down, two more took its place. Blood slicked the floors, and the air grew thick with smoke and ozone. "Sergeant, they're pushing us back," one of her soldiers cried. "Not one step back," Minji snarled, rising from cover and unleashing a hail of gunfire. "We hold the line." But even as the Marines fought with everything they had, a new threat loomed. On the bridge, the air grew colder as a massive shape emerged from the darkness beyond Varelian Prime. The Dravik flagship, a dreadnought of monstrous proportions, slid into view. It was larger than anything they had faced so far, a fortress of steel and energy. Its weapons hummed with power, and even through the void, the Erebus's sensors picked up the deadly charge building within. "Dreadnought on approach," the tactical officer reported, his voice barely above a whisper. Commander Hanuel's eyes narrowed. "Focus all long-range weapons on that ship. We bring it down before it can fire." The Erebus unleashed its fury. Railguns roared, missiles streaked across the void, and swarms of fighters dived toward the dreadnought. But the enemy vessel's shields held strong, absorbing the onslaught without flinching. Then it fired. A massive energy beam erupted from the dreadnought's core. It struck the Erebus with the force of a dying star, ripping through the ship's shields like paper. The ship shuddered violently, and consoles exploded in showers of sparks. Crew members were thrown from their stations as the deck pitched beneath them. "Shields down," the tactical officer called out, his voice strained. "We've taken heavy damage." "Damage report," Hanuel barked, gripping the edge of his console to stay upright. "Multiple hull breaches, sections 14 through 22. Weapon systems at 50%. Engines are unstable." The ship groaned like a wounded beast. Emergency lights flickered, casting the bridge in a dim, blood-red glow. Despite the chaos, Hanuel's voice remained steady. "Reroute power to the weapons. We're not done yet." But deep inside the ship, the battle was taking its toll. Minji's squad was being pushed back. They fought desperately, their armor scorched and battered, their ammunition running low. The Dravik drones advanced with relentless efficiency, their cold, mechanical forms closing in. "Fall back to the engine room," Minji ordered, firing her last clip. "We can't let them take this ship." As they ran, explosions shook the corridors. The ship's defenses were failing, and Minji knew they were out of time. But they weren't going down without a fight. On the bridge, the dreadnought prepared to fire again. The charging energy made the screens glow with eerie light, and Hanuel knew they wouldn't survive another hit. "Commander, we're losing power." "Not yet," Hanuel murmured, his mind racing. "Target their main weapon. All remaining batteries. Fire everything we've got." The Erebus roared one last time. Every remaining weapon fired in unison, streams of light and destruction lancing toward the enemy dreadnought. The enemy ship's shields flared and buckled under the onslaught, and for the first time, the massive vessel shuddered. But it wasn't enough. The dreadnought's weapon reached full charge. The beam began to glow, building toward a devastating strike that would end the Erebus and everyone on board. In the engine room, Minji and her Marines made their final stand. The Duravak poured into the chamber, and the fighting became a brutal melee. Pulse rifles ran dry, and the Marines fought with knives and fists. Minji's armor was cracked and scorched, her breath ragged, but she didn't stop. "Hold the line," she screamed, driving her blade into a drone's core. On the bridge, the countdown reached 0. The enemy weapon fired. But at that moment, a new signal flashed on the display. A surge of energy erupted from the planet below. A desperate gambit from Varelian Prime's defense grid. It struck the dreadnought's weakened shields and punched through, just as the Erebus's final volley hit home. The dreadnought exploded. The shockwave rippled through the void, tearing apart the remaining Duravik ships. Inside the Erebus, the invading drones collapsed, their connections severed. The battle was over. In the engine room, Minji slumped against the wall, her knife slipping from her fingers. The silence was deafening. On the bridge, Hanuel let out a slow breath. "Status: enemy fleet destroyed," the tactical officer reported, his voice shaking. We did it." The Erebus floated in the wreckage, battered but victorious. And for the first time, the galactic elite understood the strength of humanity and the price they were willing to pay. The Erebus shuddered violently, the sound of twisting metal and distant explosions echoing through its corridors. The ship had already taken too much damage, and everyone on board knew it. But there was no time for fear. The Duravak were relentless, and their monstrous flagship still loomed ahead, ready to deliver the killing blow. In the dimly lit engine room, Sergeant Minji's squad was barely holding on. The Duravik drones kept coming, an endless tide of cold, mechanical death. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and burning wires, and the floor was slick with blood. Minji's pulse rifle clicked empty, and she tossed it aside, drawing her combat knife. "Fall back," she shouted, but there was nowhere left to go. The drones surged forward, and the Marines fought desperately. Minji slashed and stabbed, her muscles screaming with exhaustion. A drone's claw raked across her armor, sending her crashing into the wall. She gritted her teeth, pushing herself back up as more of her soldiers fell. "Sergeant, they're breaching the reactor control," one of her team called out, panic in his voice. Minji knew what that meant. If the Duravik reached the reactor, they could take control of the ship's core, or worse, trigger a catastrophic overload. She wiped blood from her face and took a deep breath. "Seal the doors behind me," she ordered. "But that's an order," she snapped. Without waiting for a response, Minji charged forward, cutting down the nearest drones with brutal efficiency. She reached the reactor control room and slammed the emergency override, locking the heavy blast doors. Alone now, she turned to face the swarm. On the bridge, Commander Hanuel's face was pale but determined. Sparks rained from overhead panels, and the ship's status display was a sea of red. Captain Jiho stood beside him, his voice urgent. "Commander, we have to retreat. The ship can't take much more of this." Hanuel's eyes remained fixed on the enemy flagship. It was a behemoth, bristling with weapons, and nearly untouched despite their best efforts. Retreat wasn't an option, not when the fate of Varelian Prime and every life on the planet hung in the balance. No retreat, Haniel said quietly. We end this here. Jiho stared at him. But, I'm giving you an order, Captain. Prepare for a direct assault. The bridge fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. All remaining fighters, form up for a final push, Haniel continued. Divert all power to forward weapons and engines. We're taking the fight to them. The Erebus surged forward, its engines flaring as it closed the distance to the enemy flagship. Railguns fired in rapid succession, and missiles streaked through the void. Swarms of AI-enhanced fighters wove through the storm of enemy fire, taking down Baravak ships wherever they could. But the enemy flagship was too strong, its shields absorbing the onslaught without faltering. On the reactor deck, Minji fought with everything she had. Her armor was cracked and battered, and her knife was slick with dark fluid. The drones circled her like predators, waiting for an opening. She didn't give them one. A drone lunged, and she sidestepped, driving her blade into its core. Another fired a burst of energy, and she ducked, rolling behind a console for cover. But they kept coming, and she knew she couldn't hold them off much longer. On the bridge, the Erebus took another hit. The ship lurched violently, and Haniel was thrown against his console. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but he didn't even notice. Shields at critical. The tactical officer called out. One more hit like that and... Then we don't get hit again, Haniel interrupted. Overcharge the core. The bridge went silent. Jiho turned slowly, his face pale. Commander, if we overcharge the core... I know, Haniel said softly. The order was given. Deep in the heart of the ship, the reactor flared to life, energy levels rising far beyond safe limits. The Erebus became a weapon, a bomb, ready to deliver one final devastating strike. But they needed time. In the reactor room, Minji's strength was fading. She stumbled, her vision blurring, but still she fought. A drone's blade slashed across her side, and she cried out, dropping to one knee. The swarm closed in, and she knew this was the end. But she had bought them the time they needed. On the bridge, Haniel's voice was calm. All weapons, target the enemy's core. Fire everything. The Erebus unleashed its fury. Railguns, missiles, and energy cannons poured fire into the enemy flagship. The enemy ship's shields flickered and died, and the first explosions bloomed along its hull. But it wasn't enough. The enemy flagship's primary weapon began to charge again, and Haniel knew they wouldn't survive another hit. Reactor at maximum capacity, the engineering officer reported. We're ready. Haniel nodded. All hands, abandon ship. The evacuation alarm sounded, but no one moved. The crew stayed at their posts, ready to see this fight through to the end. In the reactor room, Minji slumped against the wall, her breathing ragged. She smiled bitterly. If this was how it ended, it wasn't a bad way to go. On the bridge, Haniel's hand hovered over the final command. The enemy weapon reached full charge, and the beam began to glow. Goodbye, Haniel whispered. The Erebus surged forward. The reactor breached, and the resulting explosion consumed both ships in a brilliant, blinding flash. The enemy flagship shattered, its pieces scattering through the void. On Varelian Prime, the people watched in stunned silence as the light faded. The enemy fleet was gone. The Erebus was gone. But humanity had won. The Erebus was barely holding together. Fires raged across its decks, and entire sections of the ship were open to the void. The crew was exhausted, their weapons overheating, their defenses failing. The Duravik flagship loomed ahead, its energy core pulsing, preparing for a final fatal blow. Commander Haniel gripped the edge of his console, his mind racing. There was no way out. The Erebus had given everything, but it wasn't enough. The Galactic Council had abandoned them. The so-called mighty fleets of the galaxy had retreated, leaving humanity to fight alone. Then the scanners flickered. A new signature appeared, then another, and another. A junior officer gasped, "Commander, we have incoming ships." For a split second, Haniel thought it was more enemies. But then the transmissions came through, voices filled with urgency, defiance, and hope. "This is the Keveran Protectorate, engaging the enemy. The ocean clans stand with humanity, firing rail cannons now. For the Erebus, for our fallen." The view screen lit up as dozens of ships emerged from hyperspace. They weren't part of the powerful core galactic factions that had mocked humanity. No, these were the smaller nations, the outcasts, the species that had been treated as weak. But they had seen humanity's fight. They had watched a lone Terran ship stand against an unstoppable enemy. And they had chosen to join the battle. The Duravac, caught off guard, turned their attention to the new arrivals. Plasma fire and railgun rounds tore into the swarm. The Keveran battlecruisers moved in tight formations, their heavy cannons blasting enemy vessels apart. The oceans, known for their hit-and-run tactics, darted through the battlefield, launching precise strikes at weak points. The tide was shifting. Haniel didn't hesitate. He turned to his weapons officer. "Target the enemy flagship's core. Full railgun barrage." "But Commander, we don't have enough power left." "Then reroute everything," Haniel said. "Life support, shields, everything goes to the railguns." The bridge fell into frantic motion. Warning alarms blared as the last reserves of energy drained into the ship's weapons. The Erebus was dying, but it still had one last shot. Haniel opened a direct channel to the surviving crew. His voice was calm, steady. "This is our final stand. Fire everything." The Erebus shuddered as its railguns activated. The barrels glowed white-hot as they discharged, sending hyper-accelerated tungsten rounds straight toward the Duravac flagship. The enemy ship, distracted by the new arrivals, didn't react in time. The first round punched through its hull, ripping through layer after layer of armor. The second round struck deeper, shattering internal systems. The third round hit the core. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then the enemy flagship erupted in a massive explosion. The shockwave tore through space, vaporizing nearby Duravac ships. The remaining enemy vessels hesitated, their hive mind momentarily disrupted. And in that moment, the Allied fleet struck with full force, cutting down the last remnants of the swarm. Humanity had won. But victory had a price. The Erebus was drifting, flames consuming its shattered hull. The once mighty warship was now just a wreck, barely holding together. On the bridge, Haniel's vision blurred. He felt the ship's systems failing, the oxygen thinning. His console flickered, and through the static, he caught one last transmission from the lower decks. It was Minji. Her voice was weak, but steady. "Commander, I think this is it for me," she said, coughing. Tell them we did our best." The transmission crackled. "We did good, right?" And then, static. The battlefield was silent now. The wreckage of destroyed ships drifted like shadows across the void. Broken pieces of the Duravac swarm and their defeated empire scattering into the cold abyss. The once great Erebus, humanity's pride and the symbol of their defiance, hung motionless in space. Fires still burned along its shattered hull, and entire sections were gone, torn away in the brutal fight. Yet despite its damage, it remained, battered but unbroken. Rescue ships swarmed around the Erebus, pulling survivors from the wreckage. Medical teams worked tirelessly, but the losses were staggering. The Erebus had given everything to win this battle, and its crew had paid the price. The corridors were filled with smoke and silence, the voices of the fallen lingering in every empty space. In the galactic summit chamber on Varelian Prime, the council stood in silence. The same leaders who had once mocked humanity now wore expressions of shame and awe. They had expected humanity to fail, to crumble under the might of the Duravik. Instead, the primitive species had stood alone when others fled, held the line when others surrendered, and led the charge that saved them all. Captain Jiho stood before the council, his uniform scorched and torn, his face lined with exhaustion and grief. But his voice was steady as he addressed the gathered elite. "We did not ask for this fight," Jiho began, his words calm and measured. "We did not seek war. But when the Duravik threatened all life, humanity stood, not for conquest, not for glory, but because it was right." The chamber was silent, every eye on him. The same people who had laughed at him just days ago now listened with rapt attention. The Erebus fought not just for Earth, but for every world that could not defend itself. And when others turned their backs, it was humanity who stood with courage. And we were not alone. The brave nations who answered our call, the Keverans, the oceans, and so many others, they showed the true strength of unity. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the council. "This is the legacy of the Erebus," he said softly. "Sacrifice, courage, unity. Let it be a lesson and a warning. Humanity will always fight for peace, but we will never be underestimated again." The chamber erupted in applause, not the polite, political kind, but a genuine, thunderous response. The same leaders who had once dismissed humanity now stood, honoring the species they had belittled. And behind their respect, there was something else. Fear. They had seen what humanity could do when pushed to the edge, and they knew the galaxy would never be the same. In the days that followed, the Erebus was towed back to a repair dock, though many questioned if it could ever truly be restored. Memorials sprang up across countless worlds, honoring the human crew who had stood against the tide. Statues of Sergeant Minji and her Marines were raised, their last stand becoming a symbol of defiance and bravery. Stories spread of the railgun barrage that had destroyed the Duravik flagship, of the Allied fleet inspired by humanity's courage, and of Commander Henul's unwavering leadership. But the most enduring story was the legend of the Erebus. It was said that even as it burned, it never stopped fighting, that its guns kept firing even as its hull cracked and its crew fell. And when the final shot was fired, the shot that ended the Duravik threat, it became more than a ship. It became a symbol, a promise that humanity would never back down. At the final memorial, with the stars above and the wreckage of war still visible in orbit, Captain Jiho stood before a crowd of thousands. Representatives from every allied species stood alongside human soldiers, their differences set aside in shared grief and respect. He spoke not of revenge, but of unity, of the alliances forged in battle, and the hope that such sacrifices would never be needed again. He honored the fallen, not just the humans, but every species that had stood with them. And as the ceremony ended, a new chapter began. The Erebus would be rebuilt, stronger than before. The alliances formed in the fires of war would stand against any threat, and humanity's message was clear. Earth would fight for peace, but never again would they be underestimated.